Welcome, brave souls, to a chilling journey into the depths of terror. Brace yourselves as we delve into a spine-tingling tale that will send shivers down your spine. But fear not, for you're not alone on this journey. Join us, subscribe, and hit that like button to support our channel as we uncover the darkness that lies ahead. Let the haunting begin.
Story 1. This summer, an old acquaintance and I decided to meet up. We grabbed a half-liter of cognac and headed to a park to sit on a bench by the fountain. Suddenly, a summer downpour started, and we dashed under the canopy of a tall coniferous tree nearby. We were joined under the natural shelter by a young woman of indeterminate age. She seemed to be either under the influence of drugs or moderately intoxicated. The woman was cheerful, talkative, and actively tried to engage us in conversation, but her behavior, appearance, and state of mind were not to my taste. However, my acquaintance continued to chat with her. After about 10 minutes, I had had enough of her rambling and decided to escape by putting on my headphones. At first, she either didn't notice or didn't pay attention, but then she suddenly became agitated, forgot about my companion, and started directing her aggression towards me. Smiling silently, I stood there, staring at her with a deliberately vacant gaze. At one point, through the music playing in my well-insulated headphones, I faintly heard a snippet of her sentence, "I'm a witch." I took off my headphones and rudely asked, "What kind of witch? Are you high or something?" "Don't you believe I'm a witch?" she challenged. "Come on, it's the 21st century. Get a grip," I scoffed. "Don't anger me, or I." She trailed off, searching for a suitable threat. "Your horse won't scare me. I've heard it all before." "Now, get lost," I retorted. "Just you wait and see," she muttered as she finally walked away into the rain towards the fountain. The witch then proceeded to perform bizarre rituals, walking around the fountain, bowing to it, kneeling, raising her hands in random directions, and muttering incoherently. After about 10 minutes of this strange behavior, she wandered off deeper into the park. Disappointed that there were no sanitarians around to deal with her, we decided to head to a bar for another drink. As we approached the bar, the bartender greeted us at the entrance and happily informed us that they were closing early that day. Not wanting to cause any trouble, we decided to call it a night and head home. I usually walk home after drinking to clear my head before sleep. It was about 2 kilometers from that bar to my house. So, off I went. I had walked home in various states of mind before, exhausted, tired, drunk, but never had it been so difficult to walk as it was that night. Each step felt like an immense effort. I felt sober but incredibly heavy. After walking halfway, I realized I couldn't go on and sat down on a bench. What happened next, I remember clearly, but I can't make sense of it. I took out my penknife, made a deep cut of 5 to 7 millimeters on my right thumb, and started smearing it on my face. After that, I got up and calmly walked the rest of the way home. When I woke up the next morning, I immediately recalled my bizarre Indian play and cautiously checked if my wife was still asleep. Luckily, she had already gotten up, and I was relieved to have been sleeping facing away from her. I gingerly touched my face and felt the dried blood on my fingers. I quietly slipped past my wife into the bathroom, looked into the mirror, and was shocked. Holy Mother of God! My face wasn't just smeared with blood. There were intricate patterns and symbols drawn on it. Spirals, circles, stripes from my hairline to my neck, and characters that vaguely resembled Sanskrit based on my limited knowledge of linguistics. All of these markings were painted with thick, raised, crimson strokes, as if I had used a brush instead of my finger. I began frantically washing it off, but then my wife walked into the bathroom and was just as stunned as I was. Story 2. When I was a kid, my mom would send me almost every summer to stay with her friend in this tiny backwoods town in Arkansas, population 500, in the middle of nowhere. The first night I was there, this started when I was around 8 years old, I had a bunch of nightmares and kept waking up. My mom's friend would be there, waving her hands over me and trying to calm me down. In the morning, they explained to me that there was this old lady who lived in the town. She was either a witch or a shaman, and she hated outsiders, especially city folks. Apparently, she had tried to kill me in my sleep, and my mom's friend had been keeping watch all night to protect me. Well, I was pretty mad at that old lady. They told me where she lived and warned me to stay away. But, being inspired by superhero movies, one evening I snuck out with a couple of my friend's kids to go find her house. The old lady was sitting on a bench in her yard with a black dog on a leash next to her. Now, you don't usually see dogs on leashes in a small town like that. They're usually just running around or tied up with a chain. The dog started barking like crazy when it saw us. I had enough sense not to get too close, and from about 50 feet away, I started yelling at the top of my lungs that if she didn't leave me alone, I'd put a curse on her and kill her. The dog went nuts, and the old lady dragged it back into the house. That night, I had a dream. It kept coming back in different variations over the years, probably because of the minor psychological trauma I experienced, where I was running through pitch darkness from that dog. It was barking and trying to bite me, and the leash was jingling as it ran. The only things I could see in the darkness were myself and the dog. Eventually, I'd get brave, pull out a folding chair from nowhere. I used to play a lot of wrestling games on my Sega, and start whacking the dog, which would run away yelping. Here's where the psychological trauma comes in. That same night, the old lady died. She usually sat outside in the mornings, but that day she didn't come out. My mom said they found her lying in the kitchen with one hand in the stove. It wasn't lit. She must have been reaching for something like ashes or something they keep in those old stoves, and the other hand holding a leash. There were some twigs arranged in a weird pattern on the table, along with little bottles of powders, and who knows what else. Here's another weird detail. The neighbors who saw the scene with me and the dog said there was no dog, that the old lady never had any pets, and that I had just started yelling at her for no reason. But the kids who were with me swore they saw the dog. Everyone was freaked out, to say the least. I was scared out of my mind, crying and begging God to forgive me and take the old lady to heaven. My mom and her friend tried to calm me down, saying the lady was old and it was just a coincidence that she died. The last time I had the dream about the dog was a year ago. This time, the dog didn't chase me. It just walked up to me and sat down like it was my pet, and then I woke up. My mom loves to tell stories about how my abilities showed up before and after this incident, but I don't know if I believe her. She's a bit of a fantasist and believes in all sorts of things. Story 3. It was early November, and the yellow leaves crunched under our feet as we walked down the deserted country road. Me, Kyle, Andy, and this guy we just met, Shadow. That's what he called himself, and we didn't know his real name. Andy had introduced us to him that day, but I doubt even Andy knew much about him. It all started with our shared love for urban exploration. Kyle, Andy, and I would often venture into abandoned buildings, factories, hospitals, and the like. It was thrilling, but it could also be dangerous. One wrong step, and you could find yourself plummeting down a 10-story shaft, or you might encounter the wrong kind of people and never be heard from again. Andy was usually the one who scouted out these locations. So, when he proposed we explore an entire abandoned town, I was immediately intrigued. Kyle was in as well, and we set a date for our expedition. It was only later that we found out Andy didn't actually know how to get to this town, but his friend Shadow did. Shadow was an odd character. Tall, with a black beard, and a pentagram hanging around his neck, he was in his 30s and had a strangely elongated face. His voice was what creeped me out the most, hoarse, sometimes verging on a growl. He also never took off his gloves, which I found strange, even though it was chilly outside. However, after talking to him during the car ride, my fears subsided a little. Shadow filled us in on the details of our destination. It wasn't a town, but a small village that resembled a ghost town. The journey to the village was arduous. The road was in terrible condition, full of potholes and cracks, probably neglected for decades. I was worried we'd lose a tire or two along the way. But eventually, we made it to the outskirts of the village and parked our car. The place was a picture of desolation. Bare trees surrounded dilapidated cottages, their doors creaking eerily in the wind. A few gray, gloomy apartment buildings stood tall, their windows like empty, black sockets. It was the perfect setting for a horror movie. We spent about 2.5 hours exploring the area, deciding to take a break and have a snack before heading back. We found a small tree, cut it down, and used the stump as a makeshift bench. As we ate our bread and cold cuts, I asked Shadow what he knew about the village's abandonment. He paused for a moment, then replied, "Just fragments, rumors, and even legends." "Legends?" Kyle asked. "Yeah, legends. There are many stories about this place, but they all revolve around one central theme: something evil was born here." I couldn't help but chuckle at the dramatic tone of Shadow's words. "Go on, we're all ears," Andy urged. "All right, but it's a long story," Shadow warned. "We've got all the time in the world," Kyle assured him. "Well, it all started about 100 years ago. There was a guy living here with his wife. His name was Andy, believe it or not." Shadow smiled at Andy, who looked slightly taken aback, then continued. "His wife's name was Kate, or so I've heard. They were madly in love and lived a happy life together. About a year into their marriage, Kate got pregnant and Andy was overjoyed. He went around the village, inviting everyone to celebrate the good news. Life was good until one tragic day. Kate was out in the fields, and somehow she was trampled by a cow." "You've got to be kidding me," Kyle interrupted. "That's some serious bad luck." "Hey, I'm just relaying what I've heard. There are other versions of the story too. Some say she was trampled by a horse, others claim she was attacked by wolves, or even drowned. The point is, she died, and Andy was devastated." "Go on," Andy said, his voice somber. "Andy fell into a deep depression. He shut himself in his house, rarely venturing out. The once cheerful young man became a shell of his former self. He stopped taking care of his home, and the place became overgrown with weeds and littered with empty bottles. This went on for almost a year. Andy had hit rock bottom. And when he did go out, it was usually at night to places no decent person would frequent." "You mean brothels and dives?" Andy asked, raising an eyebrow. "Yeah, something like that," Shadow replied with a hint of irritation. Anyway, Andy was a mess. Soon, the villagers started talking about a new woman in his life. They said he had a girlfriend, but hardly anyone had seen her. Those who had claimed she was a prostitute from the nearest town, but no one knew her name. There were even rumors that she was a witch, or a demon straight from hell, sent to drag Andy down with her. Take it with a grain of salt, but folks started noticing strange things happening around that time: missing chickens, odd shadows in the yard, you name it. Andy and his lady kept to themselves, though. Their home continued to deteriorate, and the bottles piled up. Shadow paused to take a sip of water, then continued. Things took a turn when Andy's girlfriend got pregnant. The happy news was soon overshadowed by loud arguments coming from their home in the middle of the night. One night, Andy even dragged her out by the hair and beat her with a stick. Thankfully, some of the villagers intervened. Despite the abuse, she gave birth to a healthy baby girl, but sadly, she died in childbirth. "What happened to the baby?" I asked, intrigued. "Well, some kind-hearted folks considered taking the child in, but in the end, Andy kept her. He named her Olga, and she grew up to be a pretty girl. But, just like her father, she kept to herself and rarely interacted with the other kids or adults. Around that time, the villagers thought things were looking up for Andy, but they were wrong. Strange occurrences started happening again. Greenish-yellow lights were seen flickering around Andy's house at night, and some folks claimed to see strange shadows flitting across the roof. There were even reports of a five-legged creature walking with an awkward gait spotted on Andy's property. Shadow leaned forward, his eyes gleaming. Then came the howls. Piercing, wolf-like howls that echoed through the village in the dead of night. That's when the rumors of witchcraft really took off. This time, Olga was accused of being the witch, supposedly taught by her mother. Parents forbade their children from playing with her, and adults avoided her as well. Life went on like this for a while, until one fateful night. Andy came rushing out of his house, his eyes wild, and let out a blood-curdling scream that chilled the villagers to the bone. Shadow paused for dramatic effect, then continued. The next day, they found Andy's body in the woods. He was dead, his hair streaked with gray, his eyes wide with terror. And that wasn't the end of it. That very night, a group of drunk men decided to take matters into their own hands and deal with Olga. They approached her house, only to find the door hanging off its hinges. As they stepped inside, a deafening howl erupted from within, and a wolf-like creature, the size of a man, came rushing out and disappeared into the forest. "What the hell?" Kyle exclaimed. Olga didn't leave her house for days after that. When she finally did, to get some water, the villagers saw that her body was covered in deep scratches. And a few months later, they noticed she had a baby bump. Shadow leaned back, his eyes never leaving our faces. Things escalated from there. Livestock started going missing. Cows, horses, you name it. Some were found ripped to shreds, as if attacked by a pack of wolves. People reported feeling like they were being watched at night, and those who came home late claimed they were being pursued by unseen entities all the way to their doorsteps. "This is getting crazier by the minute," Andy muttered. "It doesn't end there," Shadow said, his voice low. Months went by, and the villagers were too scared to do anything about Olga. They knew she was the source of their troubles, but they feared her. Then, one day, a scream pierced the air from Olga's house. No one rushed to help, hoping the witch had finally gotten what she deserved. But a few brave souls ventured inside after the screaming stopped. They came out pale-faced and refused to speak of what they'd seen. All they would say was that Olga was dead, and there was some kind of creature, covered in black fur and with claws, crawling between her legs. "What the?" I started, but Shadow held up a hand. The villagers boarded up the house and hoped that with Olga's death, their troubles would end. But things only got worse. People started disappearing. They'd leave their homes and never return. That's when the mass exodus began. The village became a ghost town, just like the one we're sitting in now. I shivered, despite the warm autumn sun. I didn't believe in such stories, but hearing it here, in this abandoned place, sent a chill down my spine. Kyle and Andy looked equally unnerved. "I bet I've scared you guys half to death," Shadow said, a hint of amusement in his voice. "Not at all," Kyle replied, though his voice lacked conviction. "What happened to Olga's baby?" Andy asked. Shadow hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. "According to rumors, a brave woman entered Olga's house and took the creature away. No one knows what became of her or the baby." "And how do you know all this?" I asked, my curiosity getting the better of me. "Oh, I have my sources," Shadow said with a mysterious smile. "We left the village around 6 in the evening, our minds filled with eerie tales and our nerves a little frayed. The whole way back, I kept thinking about the story, wondering how much of it was true and where Shadow had heard it all. After that day, I made sure to avoid Shadow. There was something about his hoarse, growling voice that sent a shiver down my spine. Story 4. I sold out pretty quickly at the farmer's market in Portland. My meat pies were a hit, especially with the locals who frequented the meat pavilion. A burly, 6-foot-tall butcher named Hank bought my last 3 pies and dug in eagerly. That's when I spotted a nasty-looking scar on his wrist, like a burn mark from an acid spill. "What happened there, Hank?" I inquired. "Oh, that. It's a long story. Remind me to tell you about it sometime," he said between bites. I didn't want to pry, but Hank seemed to be in high spirits, perhaps due to the delicious pies. As he chewed, he began to recount his tale. "You know, I travel a lot for my work, buying pigs from different farms and bringing them back to my butcher shop in Seattle. One time, back in early December, I found myself in a small town called Millfield, nestled in the woods of Oregon. It took me a while to get my bearings, and I ended up asking a local family if I could stay with them for the night. They kindly obliged, and I settled in on the evening of December 4th, planning to start my pig hunt the next morning. The lady of the house, Mrs. Carter, warned me best not to go out tomorrow. Puzzled, I asked why. "It's just not a good day to be out and about," she replied mysteriously. I didn't think much of it at the time, figuring she was just being overly cautious. Hank took a moment to wipe his mouth with a napkin before continuing. "Well, the next morning, I set out and had a productive day. I bought 3 fine pigs and spent the day taking care of business. Feeling pleased with myself, I was heading back to the Carter's place when I spotted an old woman sitting by the side of the road. She was crying and seemed to be struggling to get up. Being a gentleman, I offered my help. "Walk me home, "It's just over there," she said, pointing to a rundown shack that clearly lacked modern conveniences like central heating or electricity. I helped her inside, and she thanked me profusely. "I want to repay you, dear," she said, rummaging through an old cabinet. She pulled out a golden bracelet, ornate and clearly valuable. "Take it, it was my son's, and he passed it down to me." "Let it bring you luck," she insisted. I tried to refuse, but she skillfully slipped it onto my wrist. As I left, I felt guilty, thinking she might need to sell it for money. So, I took it off and dropped it into her mailbox, thinking she could trade it for some cash. Hank paused, taking a sip of his coffee. That night, I had a bizarre dream. The old woman was in it, and she was furious. She yelled at me, "How dare you refuse my gift? You won't get away with this. You accepted it, and now you'll take on my little helpers too." I woke up in pain. My right hand was swollen and red, right where the bracelet had been. Freaked out, I told Mrs. Carter about it, and she filled me in on the local superstitions. "You met old Maggie, the town witch. She's known for her curses, spells, and potions. People come to her for all sorts of things. She was always causing mischief, cursing crops, enchanting livestock, and who knows what else. And she died 5 years ago, on December 5th. But her spirit lingers, and she can't rest until she passes on her powers." I couldn't believe what I was hearing, but Mrs. Carter continued. "What did she give you?" I told her about the bracelet, and she gasped. "You'll be doing magic now, and those imps of hers will be your helpers. If you don't give them tasks, they'll bring you trouble." Superstition or not, I wasn't sticking around to find out. I left Millfield, hoping to leave the strange events behind. Hank shook his head, as if still unsure whether to believe what had happened. But it didn't end there. That night, I had another dream. Some creature was whining and pleading with me, "Give me work. Tell me what to do." Half asleep, I told it I wanted a big, talking parrot. I woke up thinking it was all nonsense. But then my wife started screaming with delight in the kitchen. Turns out, a bright red macaw had flown into our house through the window. In the middle of winter. We had no idea where it came from, and no one claimed it. I started thinking maybe there was something to old Maggie's curse after all. Hank finished his last bite of pie and sighed. I went back to Millfield, seeking advice from Mrs. Carter. "You need to put an end to this," she said. "Go to old Maggie's grave, drive a stake into it, and sow it with thistle. Then go to church and pray for guidance." I asked her why they hadn't done that before, and she admitted they were afraid of the supernatural. So, there I was, a burly butcher, hammering a stake into a witch's grave, hoping to end a curse. It was surreal, but the swollen hand and the parrot were proof enough that something strange was afoot. Hank smiled, perhaps at the memory of his unusual adventure. The night after I staked the grave, I drank myself into a stupor, hoping for a dreamless sleep. But the next morning, my wife called me, tears in her eyes. The parrot had gone crazy, escaped its cage, and vanished. While my wife was heartbroken, I felt a sense of relief. The curse, it seemed, had finally been broken. Now, I'm back to my regular life, raising pigs and saving up to buy my wife a gift. Oh, and those pies were fantastic, by the way. I think I'll get her a parrot, just like in my dream. Maybe it'll bring us some luck. With that, Hank bid me farewell, leaving me with a fascinating story to ponder and a newfound appreciation for the unexpected magic that can be found in the most ordinary of places. Story 5. It was a few years ago when I inherited a brand new carbine from my grandfather, who was a forest ranger. I and 2 of my buddies from college decided to go on a hunting trip, especially since the forests in the area were known to yield some impressive trophies. On the day of our trip, after hiking about 50 miles into the forest and finally bagging a massive wild boar, we decided to take a break. We dragged our catch out to a clearing, and to our surprise, there were relatively fresh remains of a campfire already there. We set up our camp, pitched a tent, and started cooking our dinner, cutting a chunk of meat from the boar. As the meat was roasting over the fire, a piercing wolf howl suddenly pierced the air in the distance. We exchanged glances, unsure of what to make of it. Roasting meat in the wild was, in hindsight, a reckless decision. Any novice hunter would have advised against it. But we, in our youthful foolishness, ignored this precaution. However, the howl seemed far away, and we assumed that the animals would be afraid to approach our campfire. So, we continued with our dinner, guns loaded and at the ready. The howls, however, started coming from different directions and distances, sometimes farther, sometimes closer. What began as solitary howls soon turned into a chorus of 2 or even 3 wolves. An uneasy feeling settled over us. None of us let go of our weapons. Darkness falls quickly in the forest. A couple of hours later, our clearing was illuminated only by the light of our campfire, which we had intentionally made larger to deter any unwelcome visitors during the night. We agreed on a watch schedule and double-checked our flare gun before my buddy and I retired to the tent for some sleep. Our guns were safely tucked beside our sleeping bags. It was almost my turn to take the next shift when we were startled by the sound of cracking branches all around our campsite. It sounded like something as big as a bear or a wild boar was forcing its way through the underbrush. The noise would abruptly stop on one side of the clearing only to start up again on the opposite side. Then, we heard a beastly roar that morphed into the cry of a child and, in an instant, turned into a wild cackle. It sent shivers down my spine. Before we knew it, my buddy on watch fired a double-barrel shot from his rifle, presumably unable to contain his nerves any longer. We rushed out of the tent, guns in hand, scanning the surroundings for any signs of danger. Finally, my other companion fired a shot into the bushes from where the sound of cracking branches was emanating. A stifled scream, eerily human-like, indicated that the shot had found its mark. As the echo of the gunshot faded, an eerie silence descended upon us. We waited anxiously for another half hour, straining to hear any sounds in the darkness. Gradually, our nerves began to settle, and it seemed like our adventure, along with the adrenaline rush, was coming to an end. I still had a couple of hours before my shift, so I decided to catch some more sleep and headed back into the tent. About 10 minutes later, just as I was drifting into a deep sleep, I was jolted awake by the heart-wrenching cries of my buddy on watch, accompanied by the pops of a flare gun. My frayed nerves must have clouded my senses because it took me a moment to realize that this wasn't another nightmare. Gunshots rang out, this time right above the tent. As I opened my eyes, the wall of the tent mere inches from my face was torn apart by sharp claws, and a snarling wolf's face appeared in the opening. Instinctively, I grabbed my carbine and fired at point-blank range. Click. A misfire. Frantically, I worked the bolt and, in the same instant, the beast clamped its jaws onto my right shoulder. I pulled the trigger again, and the shot sent the wolf flying backward. I scrambled out of the tent, tripped, and fell. As I fell, I noticed that our campfire was dying out, and if we didn't add more fuel, it would soon be extinguished. I also felt a tearing sensation as the wolf's claws ripped through my jacket. I jumped to my feet and started running, feeling the wolf's teeth snapping at my legs, trying to bring me down. Somehow, I found myself high up on a branch of a tall pine tree, looking down at the frenzied pack of wolves below. I caught my breath and glanced at what remained of our campsite. Our tent was in tatters. My hunting companions were nowhere to be seen. A few minutes later, I heard gunshots in the distance, signaling that they had fled, abandoning me to the mercy of the rabid pack. Suddenly, the clearing grew brighter as someone added fuel to the fire. Just then, a bone-chilling howl pierced the night, causing my blood to run cold. And then, silence. The commotion below my tree ceased, and the wolves turned their attention to the center of the clearing. Taking advantage of this respite, I kept a watchful eye on the unfolding events. In the flickering firelight, I spotted an old wolf with a completely gray mane. Its left front leg was noticeably shorter than the others. As a few younger wolves approached, the old wolf threw back its head and let out a long, haunting howl. The others joined in, their voices blending in a hellish chorus. The sound shook me to my core, and I hugged myself, covering my ears and squeezing my eyes shut. I was terrified of losing my sanity. When I finally gathered the courage to open my eyes, I nearly fell from my perch. In place of the wolves, I saw 6 naked men. One of them, the oldest, was completely gray-haired, and his left collarbone was broken, making his arm appear shorter than the other. The sight sent a chill down my spine, but it was nothing compared to what happened next. The men disappeared into the forest and returned with a limping woman in her 30s, her back bruised and battered. They carried another woman, older, in their arms. Her left side was blown apart by buckshot, and her face and shoulders were mutilated. Even from my vantage point, I could tell that her wounds were fatal. The old man, the apparent leader, examined her closely and, realizing that she was beyond help, threw back his head and let out a wild cry. Startled, I flinched and almost fell from the tree. The rustling of the branches under my weight caught their attention. The old man pointed at me and shouted, "It's a sign from above. Finish him off, now." My body felt like it was betraying me, but I mustered all my strength and climbed back to my perch. Suddenly, the tree began to shake violently from side to side, threatening to dislodge me at any moment. In a desperate move, I unbuckled my belt and tied myself to the tree, ensuring I wouldn't fall. Realizing they couldn't shake me loose, the men returned their attention to the dead woman. They carried her body into the bushes, along with our belongings, and began a strange ritual, reminiscent of something out of a movie. The old man pulled a black, rusted sword from the roots of a nearby tree and drew a nearly perfect circle around the clearing, about 5 meters in diameter. He then started making bizarre signs in the air near the campfire, muttering under his breath. A powerful blow to my tree nearly knocked me into the forest. It felt like a tank had slammed into it at full speed. If not for my belt, I would have shattered every bone in my body, leaving my entrails dangling from the branches of nearby trees. I hugged the trunk tightly, bracing myself for the next impact. The belt held firm, but the relentless blows continued, growing stronger with each strike. Someone was chopping at my tree with a sword. My sanctuary began to crack and splinter, pieces of bark flying off with each blow. Finally, after a particularly powerful strike, the tree below me lost its support and began to lean. The next blow caused it to tilt even more. The creatures below were jumping high, trying to use their weight to bring the tree down. Their behavior was nothing like that of ordinary wolves, and I knew this from my experience as a hunter. A series of blows later, my tree was leaning at a 50-degree angle, and I was close enough to the branches of another tree to try and reach for them. Just then, the tree beneath me lost its remaining support and, snapping branches along the way, crashed to the ground. I managed to grab hold of the branches of the neighboring tree and, sliding down, landed on the ground about 15 meters away from where the tree had fallen. The thick furs separated me from the creatures, and I took off running in the opposite direction, away from the fallen tree. I didn't know where I was going. Sheer terror drove me forward. I don't know how long I ran. I was gasping for breath, but I didn't stop. Sweat poured down my face, stinging my eyes and blinding me. I crashed into trees, tangled with branches, fell, and got up again, driven by sheer desperation. Eventually, exhaustion took its toll, and I started having hallucinations. I thought I heard the voices of people and the barking of dogs through the ringing in my ears. Then, I passed out. I woke up in a room adorned with bundles of herbs, dried mushrooms, and photographs of animals. Turning onto my side, I noticed I wasn't alone. A broad-shouldered, middle-aged man sat at a table, writing something. Noticing that I was awake, he asked, "How was your sleep?" I shrugged. "Well, I would have slept like a log after a run like that," he said. "What run?" I asked, confused. "You don't remember? You ran 70 miles 2 days ago. Straight from the wolf's clearing to our neck of the woods. The local ranger found 2 mauled bodies and your jacket with your ID. That clearing has always been considered cursed, a place where wolves gather for their rituals and make sacrifices." The man, whose name was Mitch, went on to explain that if a powerful warlock happened to stumble upon such a gathering, he could become the leader of the pack, turning them into humans and making them serve him. This transformation was achieved through a young female wolf, specifically captured and raised by the warlock. He also mentioned that for an ordinary person to stumble upon such an event, apart from an initiated warlock, was extremely dangerous and unlikely. The remains of my companions were identified only by their clothing and personal belongings. Their faces were unrecognizable. "So, you're telling me that wolves can turn into humans?" I asked, incredulous. "Have you heard of werewolves?" Mitch asked. Of course. But those are humans who turn into wolves. And you don't think it works the other way around? Do you mean to say that wolves can turn into humans? Well, you saw it with your own eyes. Or have you forgotten? Mitch gave me a strange look, a mixture of amusement and hatred. I don't know why, but at that moment, I felt that this strong, silver-haired man knew a lot more about me than he was letting on. It was as if he had been there, witnessing everything from start to finish. A week later, after dealing with the police and the aftermath of our ill-fated hunting trip, I returned home. For a long time afterward, I would wake up in the middle of the night at the sound of howling neighborhood dogs, flinching at their barks during the day. Story 6. According to my grandfather, these events took place in the mid-1970s in a small town in rural Oregon called Millfield. The town was surrounded by lush forests and rolling hills, typical of the Pacific Northwest. My grandfather, Henry, worked as a mechanic for a local farming collective, which demanded long hours during planting and harvesting seasons. Often, he and his crew would live out in the fields for weeks, making their temporary homes among the crops. It was late spring, and Henry's crew had been working tirelessly for nearly 2 weeks straight in a remote field. They had set up a makeshift camp with a wooden canopy, a large dining area, and a few mobile trailers for sleeping quarters. The field was bordered by a dense forest, beyond which lay untouched wilderness. One evening, as the crew sat down to dinner, a woman emerged from the woods. Henry described her as tall and thin, with distinctive features. She had a pretty face, but there was something odd about her, almost otherworldly, he recalled. She wore a long, gray dress made of coarse cloth, reminiscent of the pioneer days. The crew froze in surprise as the woman stepped out of the shadows of the pine trees. One of the men quickly offered her a seat and a bowl of chili, while another poured her a cup of strong, black coffee. But the woman ignored the food and instead let out a loud cry before running towards one of the tractors. The foreman, a no-nonsense man named Hank, was concerned about the safety of their equipment. He called out to her, threatening to call the sheriff if she didn't keep her hands to herself. From here on, I will recount the story in my grandfather's own words. We were all a bit puzzled by her behavior, but Hank wasn't taking any chances. He yelled at her to leave, but she didn't pay him any mind. Instead, she went straight for the tractor and started sniffing it like a curious animal. We found it hilarious and started yelling at her to stop, worried she'd inhaled too many diesel fumes. But she just stood there, ignoring us completely. Then, out of nowhere, she took off running across the field faster than any person I'd ever seen. We jumped up and gave chase, but she had vanished. Only my friend, Jack, spotted her by the pond, standing there as calm as could be. We yelled at her some more, then returned to our dinner. But something strange had happened in our absence. The chili had turned sour, covered in a layer of green mold, and the bread was spoiled too. We were baffled, wondering if some sort of witchcraft was at play. Then we realized Hank was missing. We searched everywhere, calling out for him, but he was nowhere to be found. Finally, we decided to send someone to the nearest town, about 12 miles away, to get some food and a medic. I asked Jack to go, while the rest of us kept an eye out for Hank. As we were preparing the tractor for Jack, we made a horrifying discovery. There, lying under the tractor, was Hank. We pulled him out and carried him to the trailer. He was alive but dazed, his face covered in grease. Jack sped off to town to fetch a doctor and the sheriff. By the time Jack returned with help, Hank had regained his senses. His face was still swollen, and he seemed deeply troubled. He told us we needed to leave immediately because something terrible was going to happen. We tried to calm him down, but he was insistent. He grabbed my friend, Joe, by the collar and yelled at us to pack up and leave. I pulled Hank aside and asked him what was going on. He looked at me with fear in his eyes and said he could feel something evil approaching. I pressed him for more details, but he just shook his head nervously. Then he ran off toward the field, toward the spot where the woman had disappeared. As we watched him, we noticed a storm cloud approaching from the direction of the forest. The wind picked up, and it seemed like a tornado was forming. We knew we had to leave, and quickly. We jumped into our tractors and started to drive away, but one of the tractors refused to start. Hank ran over and shouted at us to leave it, sensing the urgency of the situation. As we fled the scene, the wind howled, and the cloud drew closer. Suddenly, we smelled smoke, and then, miraculously, it started snowing. But the snow turned to ash as we realized the forest was on fire. We raced toward the river, knowing the fire couldn't reach us there. We watched in awe as the inferno consumed the forest and fields. We turned to Hank, demanding to know how he had known about the fire. He took a deep breath and began to tell us about the woman. She was no ordinary woman, he said. I believe she was a witch or some sort of spirit, and she wanted us gone. I followed her to confront her, and that's when I felt a strange force pulling me towards her. I couldn't move my head or arms, and I was terrified. She had a horrifying face, like crumpled paper, with a huge mouth and dull eyes. I recited prayers and made the sign of the cross, and she let out a wail and ran towards the pond. That's when I smelled the smoke and saw the fire. I don't know how I ended up under the tractor, but somehow I survived. We needed to get out, and fast. We stood by the river, amazed by Hank's story and grateful for his quick thinking. Other crews arrived, drawn by the fire, and we shared our incredible tale. The abandoned tractor was left behind, a charred reminder of that fateful day. In the aftermath, people speculated that the woman was a noon hag or a malevolent spirit known to torment farmers in ancient times. It seemed that our intrusion into her domain had angered her, and she sought revenge. But the tragedy wasn't over. The following year, the collective decided to reclaim the field. Hank was still the foreman, and one morning, he went missing again. After a frantic search, they found him drowned in the same pond where the spirit had disappeared. It seemed the noon hag had finally claimed her victim. Story 7. 50 years ago, during a cold winter, a little girl named Emily lived with her parents. She was 4 years old at the time. The peculiar thing about Emily was that she could see and interact with spirits. She had made friends with these spirits, who adored her. However, when she shared these experiences with her parents, they dismissed her stories, believing she was mentally challenged, despite Emily being otherwise intelligent. Emily's family was extremely poor, and her parents were neglectful and indifferent towards her. Eventually, they decided to send her to an orphanage, hoping to be rid of the responsibility of caring for her. At the orphanage, Emily made friends with the other children and enjoyed her time there. However, her spirit friends from the other world resented these new relationships and wanted her all to themselves. They urged Emily to run away from the orphanage and return to the world where they existed. One night, Emily found herself standing on the windowsill, ready to escape. With the encouragement of her spirit friends, she climbed down and made her way towards the fence that surrounded the orphanage grounds. She managed to climb over it and hide in a nearby forest, sensing that the orphanage staff had noticed her absence and were searching for her. As Emily hid among the trees, one of the orphanage staff, a guard, walked out of the gate and looked directly into the forest. Terrified, Emily listened to the whispers of her spirit friends, urging her to flee. As the guard stepped closer, he spotted Emily and gave chase. Filled with panic, Emily ran as fast as she could, screaming at the top of her lungs. Her spirit friends, determined to help her escape, guided her to pick up a knife that was lying on the ground and throw it at the guard. In her fear and desperation, Emily stabbed the guard, killing him. But her troubles were not over yet. 5 more guards appeared and began chasing her. Confused and scared, Emily turned to her spirit friends for guidance. They infused her with their dark power, and Emily underwent a terrifying transformation. Black smoke emanated from her mouth and eyes, and she became a powerful and vengeful spirit herself. The guards, witnessing this horrifying transformation, threw knives at her, one of which struck Emily in the head. Enraged by the pain and filled with dark power, Emily flew over them and sucked out their souls, leaving them lifeless on the ground with blood flowing from their eyes. After this gruesome incident, Emily returned to the orphanage and killed everyone there without mercy. However, once she had embraced her new identity as a spirit, her old spirit friends vanished, never to be seen again. Story 8. When I was born, my family lived in a small 1-bedroom apartment. Soon after my arrival, my parents realized that they needed more space, so they began searching for a 2-bedroom apartment in their neighborhood. They stumbled upon an advertisement for a charming two-bedroom apartment in a desirable area. The apartment was being sold by a mysterious woman with a name that sounded Polish. My parents fell in love with the place, and during their interactions with the woman, they agreed to a trade with an additional payment. However, while the paperwork was being finalized, the woman exhibited strange behavior. She kept complimenting my mother and trying to touch her face, and she also took an interest in my mother's black ring, which was believed to protect against the evil eye. The woman examined the ring, telling my mother about her interest in esotericism and witchcraft. My parents found her behavior unusual, but attributed it to her unique personality, and they really loved the apartment. Eventually, the deal was successfully concluded, and my family moved into their new home. During the cosmetic renovations, my mother discovered walls filled with pins and needles stuck into them. She wasn't superstitious, so she simply pulled them out with her bare hands and threw them away. Shortly after, my mother started experiencing severe angioedema, particularly on her face, with her lips and eyes swelling up. She consulted doctors and underwent numerous tests and examinations, but no physical cause could be found. The doctors diagnosed her with an allergic reaction of unknown etiology and prescribed anti-allergy medications. Interestingly, the black ring that was supposed to protect against the evil eye broke into pieces shortly after the witch had examined it. My mother also shared a strange experience she had in the bathroom. She always felt scared while washing her face, sensing that someone was standing behind her, but this feeling was limited to the bathroom and didn't occur in other parts of the apartment. She laughed it off as her overactive imagination, but it still made her wash one eye at a time, keeping the other eye open to watch out for any surprises. One day, my mother was hospitalized again due to her condition, and my parents sought help from a local healer on the advice of their friends. This healer suggested that there might be a charmed metal object hidden somewhere in the apartment. The following evening, my mother fell asleep after receiving her allergy medication at the hospital. Around 9 p.m., my father was still searching the apartment for the metal object when he found something metallic embedded in the bathroom doorway. Using a pair of pliers, he carefully extracted a tangled mess of wires that had been twisted and knotted together. He took it to the kitchen to burn it over the gas stove. Just then, the doorbell rang, startling my mother awake. She heard my father go out to the hallway and speak to someone. A few minutes later, he closed the doors and returned to the kitchen. My mother asked him who had come by so late at night. My father explained that he had found the charmed object and was in the process of burning it when the doorbell rang. It was none other than the witch from whom they had bought the apartment. She was asking if they had a spare key to the old apartment they had traded. The woman seemed distraught and tried to push past my father into the apartment, but he shut the door in her face and went back to burning the wires. It was odd because the woman lived in another city and had only bought their old one-bedroom apartment as an investment property, which she rented out. There were no buses running between the cities at that late hour, and she didn't own a car.